going to cross over to Jason Unruhe, political analyst, who's joining me right now. Thank you so much for being with us. Isn't it ironic? We look at the United States and what is being said, whether we're hearing from Nikki Haley or Donald Trump. And if we were to reflect the reality on the ground inside of the United States right now, and the dire situation economically, and of course we look at the type of pressure, and many would say the weeding away of certain human rights there, and yet Donald Trump, for example, wants to talk or point the finger at Iran. Your take on all of this, Jason?
Oh, I mean, it's simply facetious that the United States would even try to portray Iran as some kind of massive human rights violators in these protests. I mean, there are very real acts of violence being committed by agent provocateurs that are working on behalf of the U.S. Just look at even some of the smallest things that they've done, like storming particular buildings. If that kind of thing were done in the U.S. as a form of protest, there would be dozens killed. We should not forget that even the United States murdered at least a dozen college students during the 1960s at the protests against the Democratic National Convention. I mean, this kind of thing would not be tolerated. Iran has been extremely tolerant of the people protesting. I mean, this kind of thing would be unseen in the U.S. There would have been mass killings by police. Even the U.S. I mean, so many people are killed who were not even guilty of any kind of crime. I mean, the U.S. is no one to point a finger at anyone, and their claim that there's some kind of terrible crackdown going in Iran is just simply false. This is just part of a terrible narrative that they're giving, given that they're trying to pressure Iran over the JCPOA agreement and various others. I mean, this is seen by many people as even an outright act of revenge for assisting Syria defend itself from imperialist invasion. The U.S. has been interfering in Iranian politics, going back to the revolution and whatnot for untold decades. And it seems that, well, business is going to continue as usual, and the U.S. is going to interfere here just as much as they have interfered everywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, we look at this playbook. It seems like the same play is used time and time again in different parts of the world, whether we're talking about in Venezuela, or we're talking about in Ukraine, or we're talking about in, of course, as you said, Syria and Iran in 2009. And again, we see in 2017 another attempt. What is it about? We see all the time, of course, because in any nation, obviously there are going to be complaints, and people have the right in at least most of these societies to complain, take it to the streets, and these type of demonstrations then can easily be hijacked by Western intelligence services or Israeli intelligence services or others. Your take, what would you say to the Iranian young people regarding all of this?
I would say please be very careful. I know there are legitimate grievances that anybody can have with any kind of government, and I'm sure there are legitimate grievances that they have. I mean, Iran is suffering from sanctions placed on them by the U.S. and others, so there would naturally be some kind of difficulty. That's the point of placing sanctions on a country to begin with. But I think they really need to keep in mind that they should not conflate their legitimate grievances with the destabilization efforts of the United States. This is a terrible stain against the country if they were to join these kinds of people. Just because people are upset with the government over something does not mean that they're necessarily trying to overthrow it. I mean, that's just a false narrative that's being put out by the United States. The Iranian people must remember that despite any grievances that they might have, they really should place the country before any threat by U.S. imperialism. It is the primary contradiction, and imperialism does not serve the interests of the regular people who have these grievances. It would only make things worse. I think they need to stick together, stick to the principles, stick to what it is that they're upset about, and push these agent provocateurs out. If one of them is found amongst their ranks, they should be denounced and forced out. What is a a fair complaint by the people inside of Iran should not be co-opted by the United States, and their grievances should not be tainted as such with the imperialist efforts. They should remain solid to what it is that they're upset about and oppose all efforts coming in by the U.S. to destabilize the country.
Jason Unruhe, you're still with me. I want to read something Nikki Haley, U.S. ambassador to the UN, said a few hours ago regarding the situation in Iran. She says, "We must not be silent. The people are crying out for freedom. All freedom-loving people must stand with their cause. The international community made the mistake of failing to do that in 2009. We must not make that mistake again." What does this mean? Where is the line between interfering in a sovereign country's affair and even encouraging violence inside of a sovereign country? And, of course, the other side of it is, as they say, protecting the people. Your take on this?
Well, for the United States, it seems that there is absolutely no line whatsoever, that they're one and the same to them. They have some kind of, as many described as a divine right, something that comes from a phenomenon known as American exceptionalism, that they have the right to interfere in the domestic affairs of many other countries, regardless of what those problems may be. It's stock and trade for the United States to manipulate so many domestic events around the world: Venezuela, Libya, Syria, the Middle East in particular. What they're doing is outright manipulation, and this can be seen for anyone who dares shed a critical eye on the situation. The Iranian people seem to be, for the most part, aware that is happening, and I'm sure there are many who would be very quick to ally with, frankly, no other word to describe them other than terrorist organizations that are trying to use this as a justification for committing acts of violence against the government. And the United States is well aware of that and certainly willing to take advantage of that to play it to their role. And thus, any act of violence that their own agent provocateurs are carrying out, they turn around and claim are righteous acts by people wanting to be liberated, when they're really just created by the U.S. themselves. I mean, there's so much misinformation put out on the internet. I've seen images of protests from Iran on Twitter, for example, where they're images from a movie that they're passing off as something that's happening right now. So much footage from 2009 is being passed off as footage that is happening right now. This is...
And I can also say regarding that, Jason, there has been images actually on several of the Western media stations and that I actually saw myself, and they were actually pro-Islamic Republic demonstrations, and that they were saying that it was anti, because it was obvious due to the signs, the placards that they were carrying. So once again, we see this manipulation in dealing with images, manipulations and dealing with analyses. And again, the question would be, an entity like the United Nations, when would it get involved with an entity that is actually trying to interfere in overthrowing a sovereign nation? We have seen the United States in 2017 doing the same thing in Venezuela. Of course, we have seen it over the years dealing with Syria. And as you said, we saw what happened in Libya. So who is going to keep the United States in check from trying to cause color revolutions or coups d'etats?
Well, frankly, it's going to come down to a matter of military power and who it is that has the ability to stop the United States. And frankly, right now, there isn't going to be one. The UN, for all of its good intentions, has no real ability to stand up to the United States lest they lose any of their funding. And we just recently saw about $285 million cut because the world disagreed with the United States over the issue of the capital of Jerusalem. really the United States spans from a premise that might makes right, and that as long as they have the biggest gun, they are free and morally just in doing whatever it is that they feel like they can do for their own political and economic interests. It's a terrible situation where the UN definitely does need to step in and do something, but they have no real ability to do so. Once that this is already known to be interference by the U.S., what is the UN to do? Form a military force and invade the United States? I mean, such an idea is just not feasible.
Well, let's look at that aspect what you're talking about as far as the United Nations, because on the one hand, for example, Nikki Haley says that she wants to have a special session of the Security Council and talk about the situation in Iran and the necessity to do something immediately with all the hype surrounding her when she's speaking. And then we see a situation that is happening as we speak, that the Yemeni people are dying because of the Saudis. Over 14,000, almost 14,000 people have been killed in 2.5 years there. And the United Nations gives verbal condemnation, but the people continue to die there. And then you have a situation in Iran that some individuals have actually hijacked peaceful protests and are trying to destroy infrastructure, and all of a sudden they have to have an emergency meeting with the Security Council. Doesn't it take away almost the legitimacy of the United Nations to be an entity that really can make a difference in the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the UN was, well, theoretically founded on a great idea of global peace and serving the interests of the people around the world, but it seems that it doesn't often get around to doing that. And the deliberate, one suspects even deliberate ignoring of issues, particularly with regards to Yemen, do undermine whatever, what they have, the legitimacy of their moral outrage. I mean, if they can look the other way on 14,000 people dying and how many hundreds of thousands, who have contracted cholera as a result of the inhuman siege of Yemen that's been brought about by Saudi Arabia, why is this the issue that they choose to focus on? Why doesn't the UN tackle some of the very serious problems in the United States? Police killings are absolutely out of control for black ethnic minorities inside the country. And the UN doesn't have a session on, those murders being carried out, which are astronomically more than anything that has ever been seen in Iran. Or the opioid epidemic in the United States that's killing massive amounts of people through drug addiction. I mean, this is a record high levels of addiction and human suffering as a result. And this is still something that the UN doesn't feel like it really should step in and say something about, even though they are two long-going problems.
All right, Jason, stay with me. Viewers, you're looking at these live images. Cross back over to Jason Unruhe out of Ontario. Thank you so much for your patience. I want you to give me your perspective. The Iranian people are very highly, political people and highly educated populace. With this situation, now there are two sides to that, because sometimes highly educated people can also be very much influenced by Western media, Western analysis, and others. On the other side, with a political nation, there is a certain amount of awareness. Your overall perspective on the role of the people now in all of this?
I think that the people are very much involved in what is going on to a degree with a lot more understanding of what's going on as opposed to just simple participation. We see this with a lot of the major protests in a lot of country that people may be very highly active, but they're not terribly politically knowledgeable on what exactly is going on. In many cases, you could see in the United States with a high percentage of the population, for the most part, politically active have such extremely differing views on what's happening or what's causing the situation to be the way it is. Whereas, generally speaking, what you see with Iran is that spectrum of opinion on what is causing the situation or the opinion on what needs to be done, that spectrum tends to be a lot narrower with which is what you get with anybody or any group of people with a better education, a better understanding of what's going on. And I think that's a good way of putting the situation around these particular protesters having this kind of knowledge. It does limit it to much more rational forms of debate, much more rational discussion of ideas, and does not degenerate into the conspiracy theory kind of nonsense that we see with a lot of Western nations who see a terrible boogeyman lurking in the shadows all the time. And that's something that's very common in Western societies who don't live in the kind of political climate that a lot of other countries do, where you have the U.S. interfering in their situations constantly. The U.S. doesn't suffer that kind of thing. It's not a thing that they face. It's not a reality for them. It's something that happens very far away overseas, and quite often they don't even think it even exists. But I think it's still an overall benefit that people are better politically educated when they're involved, because it drastically reduces the kind of nonsense that these things can bring out. I mean, great chaos tends to attract people who are, let's say, not terribly don't have well thought out ideas and can be frankly dangerous. But with the Iranian people, we're seeing very much the opposite. We're seeing a much better educated people with a much more straightforward opinion on what is happening and what they would like to see change, as opposed to the kind of radical chaos that you'd see with somewhere like the United States.